Let's work through this job order costing comprehensive problem. Goldnest Company of Guangdong, China is a family-owned enterprise that makes bird cages for the South China market. A popular pastime among older Chinese men is to take their pet birds on daily excursions to tea houses and public parks where they meet with other bird owners to talk and play mahjong. A great deal of attention is lavished on these birds, and the bird cages are often elaborately constructed from exotic woods and contain porcelain feeding bowls and silver roosts. Goldnest Company makes a broad range of bird cages that it sells through an extensive network of street vendors who receive commissions on their sales. The Chinese currency is the renminbi. That's pronounced renminbi, which is denoted by RMB. All of the company's transactions with customers, employees, and suppliers are conducted in cash. There is no credit. Okay, now I'm reading from the second paragraph. The company uses a job order costing system in which overhead is applied to jobs on the basis of direct labor cost. At the beginning of the year, it was estimated that the total direct labor cost for the year would be 151,300 renminbi. Renminbi. I got to learn how to say that correctly. I'm used to calling it the Chinese yuan. And the total manufacturing overhead cost would be 249,645 renminbi. Renminbi. I got to get this right. At the beginning of the year, the inventory balances were as follows, and now I'll just point to it so you can see what I'm looking at. Okay, so raw materials at the beginning of the year were 10,100. Work in process at the end were 10,100, and finished goods was 8,800 renminbi. During the year, the following transactions were completed. Now I'll move the mouse off the screen so that we can read letters A through G, and then I'll slide the screen. Raw materials purchased for cash were 259,200. Raw materials requisitioned for use in production was 231,800, and they tell us that materials costing P2-21 were charged directly to jobs, and the remaining were indirect. Now, C says costs for employee services were incurred as follows, and here again we see direct labor 80,700, indirect labor 60,500, sales commissions 20,800, and administrative salaries 50,100. Okay, rent for the year was 18,600, and they tell us that 13,900 of this amount related to factory operations, and the remaining related to selling and administrative activities. And then on note E, utility costs were 10,000, and that relates to the factory. Advertising costs were 14,300. Okay, now I slid the screen up a little bit so we can read beyond the advertising cost. Note G, right here now, says depreciation recorded on equipment 26,000, of which 19,100 was on equipment used in factory operations, and the remaining 6,900 was on equipment used in selling and administrative activities. H says manufacturing overhead cost was applied to jobs, and we need to figure out what the renminbi were that were applied to jobs. Goods that had cost of 310,300 to manufacture according to the job cost sheets were completed. Sales for the year totaled 498,000 renminbi. The total cost to manufacture these goods according to their job cost sheets was 308,100. Alright, so first thing we need to do is prepare all these journal entries. And let me slide ahead and rearrange the screen, and we'll take a look at that. Okay, now I've slid back up to the top, and we're going to tackle the entries during the year. The first one here says raw materials purchased were 259,200. So I'm going to jump between pages here and show you where we work these. So if we purchased raw materials, then we would debit raw materials and credit cash. There's no credit, and the currencies involved was 259,200. So that's how we would book that first entry. Okay, then they tell us raw materials requisitioned was $231,000, of which $221,200 were charged directly to jobs. The remaining was indirect. So we've got to charge work in process for $221,200, credit raw materials for the full amount, $231,800, and the difference goes to manufacturing overhead. Okay, so $10,600, the difference right there, would be debited to manufacturing overhead. Okay, what did they tell us next? See, cost for employee services were these numbers that we see here. Direct labor, $80,700, indirect labor, $60,500, and so on. So we need to record salaries next. And to do that, we need to figure out that any of the direct labor would go directly to jobs, which means it goes to work in process. Any indirect labor goes to manufacturing overhead, and then non-product costs like sales commissions and salaries expense need to show up where it needs to go. And the credit, of course, on this one is to cash. So in this example, we see that the amount charged to jobs was $80,700 for direct labor. $60,500 must have been for indirect labor. The other two items didn't relate to product cost. Okay, and there's our $60,500 for indirect and the $80,000 for $700, and so on. Okay, Part D says rent for the year was $18,600, and of this amount related to factory operations. The remaining related to selling and administrative activities. So to record rent, we need to increase manufacturing overhead because that is a indirect cost, right? It doesn't go directly to jobs. It first flows through to manufacturing overhead, and then the portion that is an admin cost or outside of manufacturing was $4,700, and the total cash to pay for the rent was $8,600. Okay, that takes care of note D. E says utility costs incurred in the factory were $10,000. Well, that should be pretty straightforward. Utility costs are an indirect cost, so it flows to manufacturing overhead first, and we credit cash. Then on F it says advertising and cost incurred were $14,300. Okay, well, advertising has nothing to do with manufacturing, so we'll just debit advertising expense directly and credit cash for $14,300. Okay, next I want to take a look at note F. We've just finished advertising costs, so let's cover depreciation. Excuse me, note G I mean. Note G says depreciation recorded on equipment was $26,000, $19,100 was on equipment used in factory operations, and $6,900 renminbis, or renminbi. I'm not sure if an S comes on the end or not, but the $6,900 was on equipment used in selling and administrative activities. So to book that one, we'll come over here. We record the $19,100 as manufacturing overhead for depreciation on factory equipment, and then $6,900 was depreciation expense that'll flow right to the income statement directly, and is a non-product cost. And of course the credit is to accumulated depreciation. Okay, then on H, manufacturing overhead cost was applied to jobs, and we need to know how much. All right, so let me illustrate that next. Okay, now I've slid back up to the top, and I want to just read this paragraph again here. The company uses a job order costing system in which overhead is applied to jobs on the basis of direct labor cost. Okay, so they came up with an estimate that direct labor cost for the year would be $151,300, and total manufacturing cost would be $249,645. So based on that, they're using a predetermined overhead rate, and we need to calculate what that rate is. So we take the $249,645 of overhead and we divide it by the labor cost of $151,300, and what we come up with is a rate of 165% of direct labor costs. So if we take $249,645 divided by $151,300, you'll get 165%. And then right here in the problem, they said cost for employee services for direct labor was $80,700. So if we multiply the $80,700 times the 165% predetermined overhead rate, we determined how much overhead rate should be applied, and it's 133,155. Okay, now jumping back over to where we're showing the journal entries, and I realize I'm flipping between screens here so I can illustrate the information and the problem. That 133,155 shows up as a debit or an increase to work in process, and then a credit to the manufacturing overhead account, which is what we've been using all along to accumulate the various indirect costs we've incurred. Okay, so we've calculated part H. Now I says goods that had cost $310,300 to manufacture were completed. So all we've got to do now is increase finished goods and decrease work in process, right? Because we've completed those goods in the amount of 310,300 renminbis or renminbi. I'm not sure which is correct. Okay, and then J says sales for the year was $498. The total cost to manufacture these goods, according to the job cost sheets, was $308,100. So I'll jump over here, and we'll tackle number J, which says we increase cash because there's no credit sales here for $498,000, and then we record cost of goods sold equal to $308,100. And by doing that, we would debit cost of goods sold, which increases cost of goods sold, and then credit finished goods $308,100. And that takes care of requirement 1 here. Let me slide this out of the way. So we've worked our way through requirement 1 of this problem.